Cool. So we'll be having a runner put a mic back and forth in a little bit. So if you've got questions, we'll have time for that. This is for everyone. Maybe Liz, you can start us off. Let's say that things are going well. You've been able to kind of get an idea going. You're either about to raise money or you're thinking of raising money. There are some complex rules that have gotten a little bit less complex in the last few years around how a private company can raise private capital in the US, right? And so oftentimes we talk about accredited investors or unaccredited investors, and the amount of money that a company can raise from either of those sources is varied. There's been crowdfunding from an equity perspective that has taken off as of late. The SEC kind of deregulated that or opened that up a bit to allow for that. Could you just give us like a primer on what founders should be thinking of as they take on money, both in terms of SEC regs, like not to run afoul of federal government regulations, and then maybe somebody else can chime in on like the notion of over-dilution of having like 20 or 30 or 50 investors on your cap table for $1,000 each. Like what does that do and how does it complicate it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the ideal way to do it is, at the beginning, my advice is bootstrap as long as you can. The later you bring in outside investors, the more power you will have vis-a-vis those investors, which is very important down the line to make sure that you have more power to manage your company once you bring on more investors. So that's number one. Number two, when you start to raise money, yes, the cleanest way from an SEC regulation perspective to do it for a startup is to raise only money from accredited investors. And obviously you want to have the highest number or highest level of investments possible. Now that's in an ideal world. Accredited investors, by the way, are generally people who have $1 million in assets other than their house, and people who earn $200,000 a year or $300,000 for a couple. Now the problem is, as minority founders, a lot of us were, for example, the first in our family to go to college, and we don't have, an uncle, Steve, that has $1 million in the bank that can write a big check for us. So sometimes we've got to get creative. I was pleased to see there's a panel later in the day on more alternative means of funding. So, I highly suggest paying a lot of attention to that. There's some great entrepreneurs who have some experience. They'll be sharing on that panel. There's regulation, there's crowdfunding, which is something we're seeing a lot of entrepreneurs looking at. Yeah. We have some experience with that, and it's kind of a mixed bag. There are some changes being proposed to the regulations, but as they stand now, there's really no way to do it without getting a lot of sort of small ticket $1,000 investors on your cap table, which means you've got to deal with all these people in the future. So there are a lot of complications, and again, we'd be happy to speak with you, even after, in the networking session, or if you give us a call, our firm's online. And we'd be happy to talk to you about, the legal ramifications of whatever you're considering. I am a big fan of convertible notes. Convertible notes are great for your first few rounds of funding, up to, a couple $1 million. What a convertible note is it's basically looks like a loan. It gains interest. But at the time you do your equity raise, you're usually a Series A, those notes will convert into equity, usually at a discount. So those folks who have invested early will get a little bit of a bonus as compared to the investors who come in at your Series A. Convertible notes have the benefit of keeping the investors off of your cap table, so you don't have to deal with them in terms of reporting and voting and all that. And they don't come onto your cap table, or by come onto your cap table, I mean become actual shareholders until you do your Series A. And the other advantage is convertible notes are very cheap to document. I know at our firm, we probably charge about an average of $1,000 to $2,000 to document a convertible note round, compared to $6,000 to $30,000, depending on the complexity, to document a preferred stock equity investment round. So it's a huge difference. And why is that? It's because the documents are all open source.
Yep.
It's basically filling in a form that's online. The TechStars form is what we use and consider to be the market standard. So it's a very cheap way to raise money in terms of legal fees, and a very low headache way for you as a founder, so that you, in the early stages of your company, can focus on growing the business rather than dealing with a large number of investors.
So I love that you took us there because, so YC, Y Combinator, somewhat of a rival to 500 Startups and TechStars and that whole crew, decides that they can do one better. And Sam Altman and company somewhat promote this notion of a safe, right? So it's an agreement for future equity. It's kind of like a note, but kind of not. And it's also open sourced, right? And so now you can download a safe agreement from the YC website and fill it in and raise money really quickly without an attorney in that way. Prior to joining the Knight Foundation, I was heading up an angel investment group in town called Miami Angels. And a lot of times what kind of tripped things up was what we would call, I guess, take out the curse words, but it'd be a cluster in terms of the cap stack, because it was cheap and easy to download the YC safe form. And so you had some investors, some friends and families that did a safe, and then you raised some quasi-semi-professional credit investor money through a note, and then you were going to do a price round. And what you ended up with was this kind of really weird cake of layering of different financial instruments. I'd love to get you guys to give some real kind of advice here. I think there is personal preference, and there are considerations between safes and notes and all that kind of stuff. But should founders stick to one, right? Should a founder say from the beginning, hey, we're going to raise, and the market standard is this. This is the most common. Most investors are comfortable with this. We don't want to complicate future conversions, so we're going to stick to either safes or convertible notes or what price round or whatever it is. Maybe everyone can chime in, or whoever has a view on this can chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I'd like to stick to one if possible, because they all have different terms. Notes and safes are different. One of the key differences in a safe is it's actually not debt. So somebody like Tyler might like that because it's not putting debt on your balance sheet. It's simply this right to convert at a future time, and there's no interest rate. It doesn't accrue interest. There's no maturity date. It doesn't, if you have a convertible note, 18 months tick by, and you're supposed to pay it back at the end. And the startup won't have the money to do so. So now the investor has a lot of power over you. So that's why safes are great. Sometimes the investors don't want that. So usually if it's between safe and convertible note, I'm going to say, for the founder, I'm going to say go with the safe. But if you already have notes, like Raul was saying, it's a lot easier to keep one kind of instrument on the cap table, or else the whole thing becomes very complicated. It's better to just have, you have your common stock, and until you create that class of preferred, which Liz mentions is a lot more expensive to, you want to save that for when somebody's investing a real amount of money. You want to stick to either convertible notes or safes, and you want to try to have the same terms. The key terms for both notes and safes are the discount and the cap. And that just has to do with valuation and what piece of the company they're getting when it converts. So the discount is what percentage discount you get in valuation to the next round. The cap is, if your company becomes worth $1 billion, but you have a 10 million cap, they're still converting. If they invested 1 million at a 10 million cap, they're still getting 10% of the company, even if you become Google. So those are the key terms for these notes and safes, and it's better to just stick with one and to try to stick with the same rate. Now, noting that in practicality, while you have your WeWorks has been mentioned of the world, 90% of startups we deal with don't have the choice between 5 investors. They're usually beholden to the investor itself, and a lot of times where I have all this great advice is we end up just having to kind of accept what the investors want.
I want to try to add to Jason's point and make things a little bit more practical. Law can be very boring sometimes, or a lot of times. But just to highlight the importance of having a lawyer assisting you through, your round of investment. Just a quick question. Everybody has a smartphone here. When you download an app or when you start your phone, have you ever read the terms and conditions of the app that you're actually downloading? Let me see a show of hands who actually has read those terms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So not a lot of people read those, right? So when you're talking about your own company, imagine that you have a similar situation. You're having somebody from the outside coming in, and there are a lot of important documentation that you have to sign. these for us are very common terms. So SAFE, a convertible note, as Jason mentioned, if you're a founder, a SAFE is better for you. But the investors now realize that convertible note is better for them. So the point I'm trying to make is that when you're raising capital, you're going to have the investors looking through your company. You're going to have a due diligence. You're going to have to basically expose your business model and answer a lot of questions. There's going to be a lot on your mind. And our job throughout this process is to assist you, right? So you're going to come across these terms, accredited investors and accredited investors. There's a lot of things that we're talking here, trademark, patents, and you don't have to necessarily know all of that, but that's kind of our job. We want to make sure that you are having, and you have the right protections throughout the process of raising capital.
I'll go ahead and add to that. Raising money can be a very complicated process, and you got to work with professionals, and you got to get educated. Something else that can happen is dilution, right? So if you're entering into SAFE agreements and you're not understanding the valuations that are used or how it's converting, and you end up growing a very successful company, you might end up with a very small piece of that at the end of the day. So you need to know that, and that can happen very early. That can happen with your first round of investments, where you sort of get put into a corner where your opportunity to have a big stake in equity is going to be minimized as you grow the company. Another important consideration too is just who are your investors? An investor can be an important part of your team, and like we said, sometimes you don't have a lot of options. But if you're in a very early stage, going out and getting seed and having family members and friends invest in you, that can lead to very uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinners, 2 years down the road if it doesn't work out. So I would say, work with professionals, but also, the ecosystem in South Florida for investment is growing. There's a lot of angel groups. Those angel groups are growing. Even venture capital, there's a lot more, money coming into South Florida, from other states as well. So, get out in those organizations, ask for advice, and find out what's going on and get educated on it.
I feel like my Thanksgivings are awkward enough. I can't risk more awkwardness.